I would like to welcome everyone back from lunch. For those of you tuning in remotely, thanks for joining us again. We hope you had a nice snack as well. For this part of the discussion, we're going to ideally be a lot more engaging. And here is where we have to apologize for some of the realities of technology. The webcast will be a little bit behind the live feed. And so if we're coming towards a topic that you want to actively participate in and you want to speak to us from the ceiling, then you may want to join the call bridge that is also on the NTI website. So as we continue this discussion, just think about how you'd like to participate. As always, you can send me an email if there's something you want to talk about either during the meeting or afterwards. I try to keep an eye on things. So, this morning, I think, made quite a bit of progress. And it's helpful to take a look behind us and see just how far we've come in the year that we've been working on this. This genuinely has been a lot of really solid work. This is a hard problem. As I said this morning, we're trying to capture something that isn't just solving it for this sector or this platform. We're trying to create something that can be used across the entire software ecosystem, from the most devy of the DevOps web apps to some of the most old school embedded technology on which we all depend. And I think that vision is possible, and I heard that this morning. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is revisit from the morning a few quick questions for these documents about our path forward on phase one. And then I want to turn our attention to the next phase. We might call it phase two. There are a number of different next steps that we may want to move in. And for those of you watching along, there's a list on the Ntia webpage called Initial Potential Next Steps. For those of you in the room, there's a nice little handy sheet. That's not meant to commit anyone to anything. Those are some of the ideas that we've heard from you over the last few months about where this could head, and still open questions that you've flagged that we want to tackle. So the first step we're going to do is figure out the gaps, what isn't on that list, and then we'll start to walk through how do we refine this list, and ideally talk about how we can make some progress on that list. So, diving into it, the one thing from this morning that came up is that naming is still hard. And it is something that we've heard on a number of meetings, that there doesn't appear to be a single way to do it. Is this something that we think we can capture, at least explicitly, in maybe the framing document? I know that the standards and formats document also says, hey, there's no perfect way to do it. Here's some of the existing ways. Art, is that something that you see a role in the framing document?
I think the short answer is yes. We touch on it some now, but maybe not as clearly and directly as it needs to be. I think we kind of say naming is hard upon review of a bunch of existing standards and pointing to the SNF document. We think these 4, 5, 6 data attributes make up identity, but we don't actually say, yes, 1, 3, and 5 are the required ones. It's some undefined yet combination of those things. So that doesn't make for a clean way to do identity, but it's also a very messy problem, and I don't think we have the answer yet as to anything more specific. So I think the answer, again, though, the short answer is yes. At least some more acknowledgement of that problem goes in there. I think further pilots or experiments, paper or otherwise, will be needed to poke around at are our answers, are our ideas any good there or not? So, stop.
Further thoughts? Duncan.
So just point of clarification on what Art just said. So I don't think we're going to solve that problem at this meeting today. So presuming we don't solve it today, it's not going to be solved by the time the document comes out. So is the intent to have the document basically say this is what we're going to work on next time, or that we haven't solved it, or what's the intent? I don't think, what I don't want to have happen is we ignore the issue, so you read the document and can't tell it's there. But I also don't want to delay the document to solve the problem. So what are we going to do? I guess.
So one thing that's, oh, go ahead, Bruce.
The framing document, and I'm speaking for Art a little bit here, does define a way to do naming. At least it says you have to have these fields.
Right.
Now, what's in them isn't defined yet. I mean, bits or something. But I think that, I don't want anyone to think that it wasn't defined. It was defined. Right. And more work needs to be done. And personally, I think we need a directory of at least one thing, which is the supplier name, the supplier ID, the vendor ID. I don't know if everyone uses supplier here yet, but we decided to use that because that's a better term. And anyway, that ID I think has to be done, but that's my personal view and not the group's group. But the group did define what the ID was, I thought.
Something that's come up in the past that people looked at is this isn't a random uncertainty. There are, in most corners of the ecosystem, certain ways that we solve it this way over here, and we use it this way in our package manager. So I think federation could be a good approach. And Bruce, I know you've talked about the value of federation having some sort of alias list as well as a potential path forward.
Yeah, that's just part of the ID, though. I mean, and alias lists are needed, but we need at least one, which is, and then we can have more maybe.
Good.
Does it make sense in this case to be less agnostic, to use the religious terminology, more canonical in terms of specifying either the content or the format here? Because if we don't get to some resolution, the problem could get worse than it is today.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and Alan, I think there's some things that we learned in the SBOM proof of concept that I think we can leverage as to how we approach some things for the naming, what kinds and what elements need to be provided, what you might be able to establish as a quote identifier for the thing being described. So I think we at least have some reference to fall back on.
Hang on a second. I want to go Peter from Garmin. You are on the phone. Melinda, can we open up Peter's line?
Hi, can you hear me?
Line is open.
We can.
Hi. Sorry, the conversation moved ahead a little bit while I was waiting for my turn to speak. At Garmin, I've been doing a lot of the same SBOM stuff and also run into the naming challenge. The canonical name given by the supplier, and apologies for using that religious term again, what the supplier names it does have some root in trademark law, so that's very good. Alternate names are also useful, and corresponding identifiers. When there's a SWID tag or a CPE or such, we've also found that useful and to include as alternates. But I'm happy to continue the conversation with you guys after this meeting.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So again, I'm not sure I got the answer to my question. I'm not trying to solve it here. I'm trying to determine what needs to go in the document so that we can complete the document versus what needs to go on the phase 2 list so we have work to do. That's I just wanted that we all agree on that because I really do want to get the document.
Art, then.
Yeah. Let me propose hopefully a shorter version of what I tried to say a minute ago. So I'm recently very familiar with the document as of Monday evening, Tuesday morning. It is already addressed in there. I think it needs a little bit further sort of direct. This is a hard problem. We're recommending the following. We are not going any further for this document. Right, that handles the get this document done. We're willing to go this far. These fields, these attributes seem to be necessary part of naming. We're not exactly sure which ones yet. I think whether or not we state it in the document, that is a further bit of work that has to happen. And I'm very happy to have input from somebody who actually tried it, the healthcare pilot, to see what your naming problem. I saw it show up. It came up. All of your slides had no naming to pick from. So clearly that's a big problem. Yeah. Anyway, that's the document, I think, answer, right? Document answer.
And I'm sorry, can you remind me of
I'm Mark from JFrog.
Thank you.
I was basically going to endorse the approach that was in the document, which basically says, you know, this is still a hard problem that hasn't been solved. I mean, I think, you know, as we discussed, it's going to be some sort of federated solution on naming, but, you know, some sort of federated solution sort of predefines an assumption that says kind of, this is how you build even a federated solution, right? These are kind of the core elements that will make up the resulting name, you know, however they're distributed and whatever other things have to go in, you know, within a certain technology or within a certain ecosystem or whatever. That, you know, I think I know because I've given talks on it in various ecosystems, it is perfectly possible to stand up and speak for an hour on the subject of naming conventions on pretty much any technology you want to pick in this room. And therefore, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that that's its own paper to talk about it.
Good, thank you. As I say, so NTIA is particularly familiar with the one example I would argue where we've solved naming, which is DNS. And you may know that ICANN's annual budget runs in the tens of millions, which is a lot more than my budget.
Just to foot stomp Bruce's point about aliases are also known as companies buy other companies, they rebrand them, they even rebrand them when they didn't buy a company. So you will have plural aliases over time. So perhaps it's a more inclusive list of AKAs than it's a singular definitive name.
Great. Any last comments on this issue? Otherwise, our to-do item is going to be to have a little more attention paid to explicitly in the framing document, one, explicitly say it's hard, which I think it already does, and then two, say here's the short-term path forward of hit these fields. And so from those, we should be able to derive most of the other ways that you can map between different naming conventions. All right. Anything else? Anyone on the phone? For those of you who are listening on the phone, *1 gets you in the question and answer queue. Okay. So, Duncan.
Are we allowed to go to other potential topics from this morning?
Yes, other topics that were from the morning presentation.
And again, maybe this is fully addressed enough in the existing documents, but at least it came up in the healthcare, and at least to know at times it was a discussion point in framing. The issue of the word that defines version combined with patch, as opposed to some people think it's just version or whatever. Is that fully addressed at the moment, or do we still have work to do on that? So when the healthcare people said, we knew the version, but we didn't know the patch, is that just a terminology issue that they didn't use the same terminology that the framing group would have said, no, that means you didn't know the version?
Yeah, we had a sidebar on this as we headed to lunch, which was in earlier meetings, we did differentiate between a versionable patch that, you know, could have its own unique hash and version number versus a hotfix or a backport, or we had a language difference in definitions in earlier meetings. I think Rob Graham was one of the ones making that differentiation. I wonder if we'd benefit from avoiding plural uses of the term patch, right? Just for the purposes of our document, here's how we define patch, here's how we define backport, here's how we define hotfix or whatever.
And as to that point, can we get some folks from the healthcare POC to sort of talk about how a patched version of a component would be different from a new version of that component?
So Alan, when you say how it would be, are you thinking of for example, in a medical device, we may need to patch the Windows operating system. So we're not touching anything on the proprietary software that we've created, but we're going to patch the Windows operating system. So are you referring more to that situation?
And again, you know, in the Windows example, from the desktop model, that would then be a new version.
Well, typically with Windows is just going to have your base version plus, the 12 or 15 or whatever patches.
Right, so if you have a product, let's call your company Acme Medical Device, and you have an 11.5 out there, and you update your Windows underneath it, is that now not 11.5.1 or 11.6? Wouldn't you version that whole thing?
Historically, that's what's happened.
So that's why we don't want to differentiate.
Historically, it's been a new, but that's more historical. I mean, certainly I think manufacturers are looking at more efficient ways to do patching when it comes to the OSs and et cetera. And therefore, I think some discussion amongst, the manufacturers would be good to understand how each and every one might treat it.
Just to throw a monkey wrench into this whole patching concept here in the SBOM, after a medical device vendor sells us the product, some of them even let us patch them ourselves with Windows updates. So then what happens to the SBOMs that we have been delivered from the vendor who doesn't know what we've patched? So how do we keep track of that now?
Reading Art's document, you're now the vendor. You're now the supplier.
You're now the author.
Yeah, right. So you get to create the next SBOM.
You have forked their supplier's product. There's an R in that word, by the way. I want to be very clear. Yes, 1, 2.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
And so Alan, I think another interesting aspect of that is how do you identify that patching in the SBOM itself? So you're using a version of Windows that's been released, such and such, it has a version number, you've got 12. How do I, as a manufacturer, include the information about the patching? Are they questions I think that to ask and to resolve? Are those individual patching components?
Well, I think that's also in his document, but it's a big compound part with a version number and a hash.
Yeah.
So is that
I was just going to basically comment on how Debian and Ubuntu do it, which is they make it explicit that a patch has been applied. And they have the patches listed separately. They have a pristine start point, they have the patches, and then the sequencing.
So you've got to hierarchically, does it become another hop? Because it's a next level of that base operating system, right?
Bruce.
So the patch really has to be treated like a different component, I think. And then it needs a relationship between that and whatever it's patching, so people understand that. And it's so a patch really isn't like a patch in the sense of something else. It's a new component. And then you say, okay, my bill of materials changed and now has this new component, which is this patch, and that has this relationship to this product. Versions, though, the way that they're usually used is they just go forward, maybe within they might fork, but they seem to go forward, and they don't have this happens before this, or you can't, whereas patches, you can take different collections of them in different orders and include them or not.
So the framing document has a set of when do we update the SBOM, and it includes when you change an underlying version. Can we have another section in there explicitly on patches?
Another thorny problem. Sure, pending time and some effort. I want to say, though, this has come up at almost every meeting, I think, and it's still clearly unresolved, and that's perfectly fine. I believe what the framing document has in it, it may not be clear enough, does cover these situations, and it could be that the patch is a new component I add to my list of components, or that the patched thing itself becomes a new component. I think both of those are possibly okay, and what I'll suggest is, if we had some pictures of, and what I'm thinking of is, here's a very average tree. We already have the pictures with the agreed upon Acme software and Bob's browser. If we have one of those with a patch, one of those with a new component, that might help us all figure out how I handle this situation, right? I'll agree it's not well defined yet, but it's also pretty squishy. So I think for the sake of the document, we'll probably try to be a little more clear about it, but I think it is unsolved. And again, really like to hear from the healthcare folks how well or poorly that part went. But I think on paper it's achievable, at least.
Bruce.
One comment on that, and that is if you have 10 patches outstanding and they're independent, and you want to make a new version, you know, you have an awful lot of new versions, so you really need to treat them as separate. And just from a practical point of view. But that's just my view as a comment on which way to go on that.
So I want to ask a follow-up question, which is the use of the SBOM. So now, in addition to looking for what's in there, you also need to look, if you're trying to do this for vulnerability management, you need a tool that will verify what isn't in there. Right? My tool says I should be using a component that has these patches. Is that right? Am I characterizing that properly?
I mean, to that point, if you recall the simplest use case we said at the very first meeting for the SamSam ransomware that hit Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, simply knowing you have the JBoss product in some subset of your devices lets you go from 20,000 devices to maybe 200. Knowing that flaw only affects a certain range of JBoss versions lets you maybe take it from 200 to 20. So even knowing the presence of the project is actionable for our most basic vulnerability management. Am I affected? Where am I affected? It gets better as we get more precise because vulnerabilities cleave to or match up to versions and version ranges. So this is just in the fine points of how much do I narrow that tunnel from 20,000 to 20 or 30 based on how we articulate a patch. So let's not say this is a deal breaker, it's a refinement.
Good. No, thank you. I think that's a good way of characterizing it. Any further thoughts on this question of a patch is different from a version? Yes, Lori.
I would bring out the comment that the patches could be maintained separately from the software. So you might have a base product which evolves on its own, and then you have a set of patches which you always have to apply. It's happening in the Debian world. It happens all the time, and in this sense, I would actually put them in the same category as, for example, compile options, which is, I guess it's not yet in this discussion so focused yet, but if you want to do vulnerability management, that this will be actually a very important option. And in the same way, you should be having information about the base software, then what kind of modifications are being applied to that, and that includes both the patches and also compile options in a way. So that would be a meaningful way of managing it from the vulnerability perspective I see. Thank you. It should be definitely. There will be a critical difference. For example, if you use stack guarding or canaries or not, and so forth. So
the order the patch is applied.
It should be part of the information somewhere, and probably maintained separately from the software itself.
In some senses, this is all starting to head towards a concept that's out there of complete and corresponding source type of information, which is all the pieces you need to be able to reproduce the build effectively.
And reproducible build is a lovely direction to head in, but still something that looks pretty far off.
So the compile our options is one of the things we talk about in the pedigree area. So it has a logical place, whether it has to be as pedigree, field or whatever we decide to call it. But yeah, that level of detail is definitely part of what anyone who really wants to know how their software is going to behave needs.
Doug.
So I was just going to say, following on the previous comment, but Bob said part of it, but now I want to hitchhike on it slightly differently, is this does get into the area of the Annex 2 of the use case document, which I assume will be on the future work list that we want to actually work on that. But it also ties in with another point that came up this morning that we haven't touched on, so maybe we can lump them all together, which is configuration. So sort of patches, configuration, provenance, pedigree, it's all in a next time lump, right?
Yes, so once and again, we're getting really combinatoric very quickly. If you want to go into config management, there is 20 years of reproducible build research, and we will wander into that territory later.
Not sure where this fits on the agenda, but just a point of order in case we're running low on time. we had a bunch of questions for the FDA representative who is now here. So one of the unresolved things from this morning is how far deep for that?
No, I think from this morning,
when does that
the document says, we're pretty clear on the documents,
right.
Which is, this is the bare minimum. So we're going to move forward on the sort of the next steps.
So there's nothing for him?
Do you need to run away?
If it comes up later, that's fine.
It'll come up later.
It seems unnatural to say anything.
Okay. Yeah, I want to focus on the documents that we talked about this morning. Further questions of, yes? Great.
So we agreed in the formats group there'd be no winners, or there wouldn't be a single winner. So we picked 2 winners and 3 or 4 runners up in the back. Is that the whole, what was the name of it? Cyclone DX. Is that a to-do item to discuss? Is that a next time work item? Where did that end up, I guess?
So that discussion after a good 20 or so minutes said the goal is cross-compatibility. And if someone comes forward, they said I thought they were pretty clear at saying if someone comes forward and says, here's the field mapping, we'll put it in, because it's field mapping is the priority. Did anyone get anything different from what was said this morning? Yes.
So just to be clear, so if I gave them change table 1 and add this column with Cyclone DX is this field that uses this, and this, it goes in, or I got the impression there was more to it.
I got the impression they have 2 weeks to do it, and I nudged Steve Springett to do it.
Kate, thoughts on this?
You caught
me. We are revisiting the discussion from this morning to say for table mapping, right? The goal was to sort of make sure that we've got cross-compatibility.
Right.
And so if someone in the next week, because 2 weeks is not enough time for the group to do its work, if someone spends this weekend writing out more rows for that table, more columns for that table.
If someone wants to write more rows for that table, that's great. I think we're missing the relationship, though, in Cyclone DX. I think that's the missing piece right now from the canonical definition that the framing group gave.
I mean, what I got out of it was that people could add new standards anytime they felt like it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's fine.
And Cyclone, just to comment, Cyclone deals with relationships by direct nesting, so it's a little bit, it's more kind of natively XML than the way that SWID or SPDX handle it, for what it's worth.
Can it handle it, yes or no?
Yes, it can.
So that means it could go in?
But it's just, conceptually it's different. That's why it looks like it's missing.
So we have the folks, and again, want to make clear, if folks come forward at the very last minute, again, I'm very happy to have this discussion, but at the same time, those are the 2 standards that have been talked about for quite some time. So yes, it would be great, but I also want to keep in mind that we want to get these documents in phase 1 finished. Further comments on a list? Thank you. Tree direction. I agree that this is something that we should probably all talk about things the same way. I don't know we're going to resolve it on its merits. Are there folks who have something that can help us appreciate how they view this?
I think what we need is a tree mapping table.
Clearly, we need another picture entirely. Tree's not doing it. So
more visual representation.
More crazy pictures.
We'll get the metaphor right eventually.
Well, we've done up and down, and we've done left, so I guess we should pick right.
Yes.
So we keep using a lot of metaphors upstream and downstream, and then we put a picture of a tree in its place because that's clearly the stream we were trying to tackle. So picking a metaphor would be a good first step.
I think I'm hearing a river system then.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Tributaries, right?
And just to play off the note that you said, I'm someone who always liked the root of the tree at the top of the page, just because that's how I'm used to thinking about directed acyclic graphs. Art brought up the point that you just highlighted, which is we talk about upstream and downstream are pretty unambiguous in the supply chain. And so it makes sense to have higher in the tree be upstream. That is one way of thinking about the orientation of the tree.
just to not to beat this too hard to death. The graph works no matter, the graph is mathematically doesn't care as long as the relationship goes the right way. That's not the problem here. It's more, are we going to confuse people who are seeing the word recursive and nested and wondering what we're talking about for the first time and looking at the graph and being confused. That's where the metaphor could be helpful, and I want to not confuse them right off the bat.
Every map has a north, so we could just say which one's north.
Right. Well, north is up. So
an NCAA style bracket could be an option.
So I still think for upstream and downstream, right to left is better. But I've never seen a graph that had a funnel the way you guys do it. But I think you'll be more confusing the way you have it. But more importantly, maybe we should stop using the word tree and just keep it as a graph. And I think usually in graphs, when you have one node and end nodes, the one's always on the top and end's always on the bottom. So
it comes down to, right, we have a sort of a wide audience, I guess, we've been trying to accommodate or reach. So we can say graph, and that has perfectly good meaning, and it's fine, but if people aren't glomming onto that, that's why we're saying river, tree, something else, right?
So I guess a further point on that then. So we have a software bill of materials. Do we have experience? The field of bill of materials has been around a long time and has a lot of work. How do they draw it? However they draw it, let's do it. Let's not make software be different.
Fair point. We will go and seek that out. Did you have a comment, Josh? Brendan, you had a comment.
Just to somewhat to cut the Gordian knot in half, if we're going to pick one of these three incompatible representations, I think since we're going to confuse significant groups of people no matter what, I think we go with the left to right interface, because everybody looks at left to right and knows that, oh good, this group made up their own definition of words, and it makes it easier for everyone to just start. Because everybody thinks they know how a tree works. As it turns out, we have many different ways of incompatible thinking about how trees work. So I would throw my weight behind what Josh's group outlined. Also true, they had better graphic design than the other teams.
All right. Any further thoughts? This is the last time we will talk about this today on the left to right idea. All right. So, further thoughts from the documents this morning that we talked about, things that were flagged. We've got most of the things on my list, a lot of the other ones on terms of best practice, depth, things like that. Clearly a next step, a practices and awareness and adoption story. So the next thing worth spending just a little bit of time on is how we would like to share these documents. We've had this conversation now for the last few meetings of freestanding versus tightly bundled versus loosely coupled. And it is my sense that the emphasis has sort of been loosely coupled, seems like the path that I've heard a lot of people talk about. But I think it'd be useful to talk about that for a little bit if anyone has some thoughts about how they see these documents being shared and used and consumed. Duncan.
I vote as little change as possible so that we could get them out sooner rather than later.
Thank you. I like that. Great. So as it currently stands, they reference each other. We'll make sure that the references are all lined up. A number of folks have done some deconflict, and as you read through, we can make sure that none of them blatantly contradict each other. I think the definitions have been well aligned, thanks to some folks between healthcare and framing. And so now, any further thoughts on sort of how we cluster these together? And so now we have the question of presentation. So some of it's easy, right? We can merge, they can all be in one document and then 4 separate documents. We can have those options together. Many of you have made some comments about the NTIA website. So right now, whoops, what happened to those? Hang on a second. Those got closed. That's unfortunate. So let me give you, this is the NTIA Software Transparency website, which you can see is basically a reverse ledger, right? It's basically just a whole bunch of stuff that we're doing, keeping track. Probably not the best thing to send someone to if we're trying to say, hey, check out these documents here. I'll give you an example of what a previous NTIA project did, still using our less than stellar content management system, but sort of has a, hey, here's some documents, here's a very short paragraph about them, here's the link. That's one option of something that could exist, and then we'll have some of the process information below. Are there other ways in the short run? Again, I can't promise that we'll magically have a really great web team by the end of the month. But our web team is hard and works hard, and they are responsive. And so are there things that you would like or can envision about how you'd like these documents out there?
Can we have a diagonal dodecahedron?
3-dimensional, holographic? Yeah. A tactile experience.
So under the vision side of it as opposed to the practical this week side of it, would you at least consider like something like putting it, in Markdown language on GitHub as a publicly available, stays forever, and more importantly, people could you don't have to do all the work. People could do pull requests. You want to make it look prettier? Put in a pull request.
So let's put that on the next phase style thing. Because I think these are still, we have documents, and if the document, someone goes and says, oh, I think an SBOM should be this, that's great, but yeah.
One of the things that we do in another group is all of the guides. There's a set of guides to do for the open source program offices, and they're all up on GitHubs, and issues are pulled there as well. And as you say, I think it works fairly well for keeping documents working over time as needed. So I second that request.
Yes. Jim, then.
So I think what it will be used as is 2 things. One is a link to specific documents and a link to a place where I can get the set of documents. So anything that satisfies that would be sufficient, such as that.
I was just going to comment, we have 3 distinct documents or 4. There's nothing that's pulling it together like a small intro. That's probably a couple of pages, and then link it to everything else.
Great, yeah. Having a short overview could be very useful. That's something that I can work with some folks to draft and then circulate. And in fact, I'm guessing there's language in many of your documents today that is that high-level overview that could be very powerful. Thank you. Good suggestion. Other thoughts on just sort of saying, hey, we want PDFs, how do we get them, and what would be useful for the people that you would want to communicate to?
It's a little orthogonal to what we're currently describing, but people were looking for what's every deliverable out of each working group, and it was kind of hard to find, in a consistent tree or something like that. Like we had a PowerPoint for each working group each time we met here, but finding them very easily, hierarchically or chronologically, even if they're not the final product, there's still some valuable stuff in there.
So making sure that we have the archive of all of the things that you've done to document
That's
the
right.
process. Great, that's a good suggestion. Further thoughts on how do we share the outcomes of this? Duncan.
So just point of clarification. So this is an NTIA multi-stakeholder group. What is the status of the outcomes of this? In other words, we're creating documents. They exist. Is it sort of the NTIA says this is now mine and they put it out, or it's just hey, we made this in a meeting and we're done, or because that might affect how we present it, what it is we're actually talking about.
So the term used, if you pop back to the stakeholder drafted documents with some idea of when they were finalized. Each document contains either some information about the process that was used or links to another document that documents that. We keep it on the ntia.gov website, but make it very clear that it is not a government publication, but it is, and my colleague Louise has actually spent a little bit of time trying to understand the legal status of that. But the short of it is that anyone can pick it up, use it, share it, etc. The last question I'm going to ask you is, in addition to having 4 documents with a little blurb and a little overview blurb, useful to also have a Frankenstein PDF that someone can just say, here's all of them? Or is that something that is you don't need? I see some nods, I see some head shakes. Anyone want to make the case for Frankenstein? Frankenstein's monster. Yeah. Okay. Is there a reason to not have that as another edition? Yeah. No. Bob, as you give a...
No, I was going to have a different point.
Okay. Yeah. Jim.
It's harder to find what you're looking for.
Good.
My reason for not having it is just work somebody's got to do. So that it's going to delay everything.
Fair point. Basically, just like having an S-bomb, having all of them together. Anyone feel strongly one way or the other?
Well, there are 4 components.
Yes, there are 4 components. And so is there anyone who, when they think about how they would use these documents, thinks that it would be easier to have a single link versus 4 links, or just a single file versus 4 files? So they'll be on one link.
Are we talking about both being an option, or does
Yeah.
everyone? Yeah, sure.
Okay,
If it's both, problem solved. Right?
great. All right, so that's most of the presentation stuff I've got. Bob?
Good use of word, presentations. I'd like to see something up there about presentations, about the effort. You've done 1 or 2. If other people had things to donate, because if I'm going to go talk to people about this, I'd like not to start with a blank sheet of paper.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to slot that into the next steps discussion. All right, so everyone take a nice deep breath. We now have a path for, right, we're not at the finish line, but we can see the end of lap 1, which is these documents polished. We all have our marching orders, and we have our timelines to get them a little more smooth and finalized. I'll be working with all the working groups to think about this presentation layer and making sure that folks who are new to the process can still get information, things like that. So, now we get to turn to the fun side of things, which is what comes next. I've heard a number of ideas from folks, really for the last several meetings, about other things that we want to do that weren't captured in the work that we wanted to get done. There are 4 broad buckets here that I've tried to characterize. They're not perfect buckets. Moreover, they don't easily map to the established working group structures. Some of them do, some of them don't. And so what I'd like to start off by doing is saying, what isn't on this list? So Bob just talked about, let's collect presentations. And other documents. So that could be a very powerful thing to sort of say, hey, here's some of the writing that we've got. Here's stuff that is a brown list. Yeah.
It's in the same line as presentations, but is there some way of having effectively a gold deck for people who are trying to evangelize this in their own communities that they can pull off of?
I like the idea of having sort of a shared deck. The challenge I would have with that is how do we get community approval about speaking on behalf of it? So it's one thing to say, I'm going to pull from the slides that came from each working group, but let's put that on the list of things to think about. The gold deck idea, and we can just have these as individual bullets. Emily?
I was wondering, I'm a little late to this discussion, but I'm wondering, is there already some thinking around who are the strategic pockets where you wish to have engagement be extra strong, and how to prioritize who you're speaking with in those arenas?
That's a great question. I think what you've reminded me is I've handed out a piece of paper, but I didn't sort of do a quick walkthrough of it. So I'm going to take a moment and do a quick walkthrough because almost all of these are ideas that I've heard from various experts in this field and all of you over the past few months. So take a step back. Extending and refining the model. So there are some big unknowns that we still have in terms of what is the SBOM approach. How do we share the data? So what does that look like? Sometimes it's fairly straightforward. SWID tags follow binaries. Other times it's clearly not. And so need to think through what that universe can look like. The high assurance stuff that's sort of spelled out. We've got sort of some basic assurance in the framing document with integrity and hashes, but there's certainly a lot of work to do, and that can go very far into high assurance computing. SBOMs for things that aren't on-prem. Most of what we've talked about has been embedded or on-prem. Very few people stand up and give speeches that say the future of software is on-prem software. So what are the use cases and what needs to change, or how do we need to think about this for cloud, SaaS, containerized, all of the fun, slightly different buckets that we have for software moving forward. And then the last one I have that some folks have mentioned repeatedly, and we really need a better name for this, is communicating non-exploitability of vulnerable components. So yes, I'm using OpenSSH, but I'm only using the PRNG. So I'm simply never calling that code, and I've also done some basic testing to show that it's not vulnerable. So let me communicate it downstream so it doesn't light up people's dashboards. So that's the 2 fingers? 2 fingers.
I think it's artificially narrowing the current phrasing because it may not be about exploitability, it might be other postures such as there's mitigating controls, there's configuration options. I think the exploitability is way too specific. So if we could abstract that, I could help later. But the way we've captured it is too specific.
Do you have you're good with pithy names? Do you have
I've been calling it, the disposition, I think was the phrase I've been using, but it's not well thought through.
I like disposition.
We've been using context.
Context covers a lot. Bruce, did you have something?
I like disposition.
Disposition.
Because then that means, you don't have to do anything. You have to apply this patch as mitigation or something.
It's better than what I've referred to it as the "don't worry your pretty little head" field.
The current framing document mentions twice in different places, but consistently it says exploitability or exposure are the words it uses currently. But it's a pretty light treatment. We don't get into it in detail. Just that's the current word.
Disposition or exposure or exploitability. We can. All right. Well, we will. As the folks, whoever is tackling that issue, that will be one of the first things that you will do is sort of figure it out. So those are all in the two fingers. Two fingers? Yeah. If it is something that is directly relevant, not to unpack, not to drive the discussion further, but to clarify, directly relevant. So this is one finger, I have a point, two fingers, this is directly relevant to what's going on. Yes? Yes, that is the plan. I'm going to go through the whole document first. Thank you. So, and if I come up with something that you want to clarify, that's the two fingers. So, tooling, and the version online has been extended to tooling processes. Did you have a two finger?
Yeah, I had about the extending and refining the model. Is there a place for discussing doing more abstraction? Like there is for example, this component implements this protocol, but the other way around, that this is needed for this. But where can we have this discussion?
First, the process question is we're gonna add to the list after we walk through it.
Okay.
But yes, that's something that in fact was in an earlier graphic where they said, oh, this component implements this thing. So that would be we'll carry that forward. So tooling, and the version that is now online says tooling and processes because they're sort of something that we want to tie together. So one of them is what tools exist today for generating SBOM data and for consuming SBOM data. What further tools are needed, which is a very big, expansive question that is going to be highly context dependent. And then could be a time to sort of also say, hey, are there operational lessons that we can carry forward more explicitly from folks that are doing this, either directly from the proof of concept or other examples? So that's what I've tried to bucket into the tooling and processes side of things.
Can you add services to tooling?
Tooling, processes, and services.
Well, no, I was trying to clarify because I thought tooling meant.
Thank you. Sorry.
I thought tooling might have meant services, and that's why I asked.
So, next bucket, awareness and adoption. This is sort of the, how do we get this out into the world? This gets back to the comment that Emily said of, hey, should we have a broader strategy to think this through? Then there's sort of more sector-specific or technology-specific outreaches. So once we prioritize that, what does that look like? What are venues that we should be engaging? Are there champions that we should be, that should come from, someone is going to go off into this community and be the evangelist in that community. Model contract language is something that a lot of folks talk about. How do I ask for an SBOM from my suppliers? What does that look like? How precise do I need to be? What's a lightweight way of doing it? What gives me what I need to do? Something that's come up in a couple of the working group calls is the value of having a FAQ or FAQ, depending on your butchering of the language. So that's another area where you can imagine having so you've just gotten started to this. As you read these documents, here's something that can go along with it. Here are the common questions. Is this a roadmap for the attacker? Things like that. And then the fourth bucket is sort of the demonstrations. I'm sorry, Kate.
In terms of awareness and adoption, do we also want to add translations since we're international?
Yep, and we're going to add more. We're going to have the gap analysis in just a moment. Sorry, I'm trying to walk through so demonstrations, which is 1, the proof of concept 2.0, 2, potentially further proof of concepts in other sectors, and then in addition to exercises, which require lots of work, we know that there are folks out there that are doing this today, and so can we engage in some documentation or solicit case studies, things like that. So again, this is a lot of work. This is sort of the broad vision. Everything that I've heard, I've tried to capture. But even that's not enough because there are lots of great ideas in this room. So on the awareness and adoption side, there were translations. Yes, Duncan.
So ones that are missing here, is now the time to bring it up?
Now is the time to bring them up.
All right. So I think you're missing 3 in the first section, at least that we discussed this morning, since I didn't see them on there. So one is further work on naming or whatever we're going to do there. Another one is the value of complete, or whatever the words are going to be for this whole, how complete, how transparent or opaque you make beyond the first level. That issue, I think, needs more work. And then the whole discussion we had both this afternoon and this morning on version / patch / update / config / et cetera.
Great. And I think some of those are sort of naturally in the same constituency. And some of them, I think, for example, the depth question almost might be in an awareness and adoption story as well, because different markets are going to want to think about it differently.
I just want it somewhere on the list. That's all.
Completely. Thank you. All right. This is now your chance. Other things that are missing. We had translations. Lori, you had can you remind us what you're talking about?
Abstractization. So abstractization. So, for example, the component is required for HTTP server, let's say. So you could basically switch out components easily in the process when you are resolving your vulnerabilities. That would be going into the extending refining model part, I guess.
Oh, interesting. So specification of what the component is doing.
And why it's actually necessary in this part. It is probably not really required component, but it would definitely help people to solve like the problems that they occur in the ecosystem.
That's it. Really interesting idea. Thank you. Yes. Let's put that in the extending and refining the model, which we would call that maybe implementing or specifications of what the component's doing, exactly. Other areas. Bruce.
I think we need to have use case specific items to add to what's in the scoping document. The framework document now. So today what's in there is everybody needs this, and now we need to go to the next step, refinement step, I guess, to say, okay, for this application, I'll just call it that word. I know that the words are under discussion. You need these fields, and this is the definition of them. And step 1's probably define which cases we're going to cover, and then step 2 is what are the columns, like all column for this statement that are needed, and what is their definition.
Do you have some examples in mind?
Well, vulnerability management is one, obviously, since that's been coming up a lot. But there's other people have ideas of what they want, and which might be handling licenses, which is distinct, and is probably the most common one used right now is for people doing SBOMs, as far as I know.
Nice. Duncan, you had Emily.
Well, I was mainly pointing at the FDA when he asked for sector-specific ones, since we had a sector sitting in the room. I was just pointing to.
All right. Seth, you've now been invoked twice.
How many fingers is that? What am I supposed to say?
So we've talked a little about depth.
Yeah.
And I know that you have thought a little bit about what you're going to be looking for from it. For those of you who don't know Seth works for the FDA. Tell them just 20 seconds of background or 60 seconds of background.
Yeah, so I work at the FDA, as you said, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. We've been on the forefront of getting policy together for the medical device manufacturers, but also working within the healthcare sector at large. I happen to be sort of principally involved in the pre-market policy that we're currently revising right now that has SBOM, I'll call them. They're not requirements per se, so I'll defer to my legal colleagues, but what it is that we need to manage risk. We can call them recommendations, but that's what we're working on. So I have some thoughts about depth. We're actually working on an issue right now. So just to use a use case that makes a lot of sense in terms of how do we answer the question of depth. VxWorks, our real-time operating system, was just, I forget how long ago, was essentially vulnerable. And I had a lot of conversations in and around DEF CON about, we're talking to medical device manufacturers and others, hey, am I vulnerable? No, we don't use VxWorks. We don't use that particular version. Well, actually, it's a subcomponent of VxWorks that's actually vulnerable. So what we have here is if we don't get the right depth, then we create a situation where we have false negatives. And in the field that I come from, which is healthcare, false negatives are usually bad. So not only was it a subcomponent, but the subcomponent was sold as to other RTOS vendors as well. So this actually impacts other real-time operating systems. So if you're only looking for VxWorks, if you're only doing that level, you're going to miss a bunch of stuff. And I just don't think I understand where we're starting, but it's just not acceptable to miss things. So how deep do we have to go? Well, we have to go as deep as we need to find the vulnerability, which is why the tooling question for me becomes very important. I can dig a ditch by hand for sure, but I've done both. I prefer the excavator; they're fun. I'd love to have more discussions around that, but we need to go as deep as we need to.
Great example. I mean, there were, I don't know how many conversations at DEF CON I had that were all SBOM problems. There were all these vol management problems that are multi-vendor are, someone didn't go back far enough to realize that, and Bruce's point about aliases, right? This specific example, what was the name of the library? No, not that far back. But the company that Wind River acquired at some point had a different name, sold to more than Wind River. Wind River bought them up. So you have an aliasing problem for product name and for the company name, supplier name. Anyway, it's a classic, and everyone is just like that if it's a multi-vendor issue. So you need depth, period.
Yeah,
end of discussion.
And honestly, it's a use case that's I have to spend cycles on it right now to deal with, and it's difficult. So can we come up with something that solves that, or begins to work on that? That'd be great. I'd really like to not do anything, right? That's what I'm trying to say.
No, I think a lot of it's desire. That's what we're in this.
So, does anyone have a two-finger comment set on Seth's remarks? Yeah.
Well, so just a point of clarification. So the FDA has requested going full depth. We have, as a group, has agreed we're coming up with tools that could go one, could go full. We're not going to say how far to go. How do we, in phase 2 and next steps, not today. Today we are where we're at. I'm not proposing to change a single document we have. But for phase 2, how do we show the value of going deeper, I guess, is the point we need to somehow get on our list.
All right, I'll bridge this two-finger to the prior two-finger. Over lunch, it's not a great idea, but maybe someone will improve this idea. But over lunch, I said, you know what might help is if we just show a couple attacks that have happened in the last year or two that could have been handled with 1 being greater than 0, but most of them are 2 or 3 or 4. Then when people say, oh, I remember that attack, it might just be painfully obvious how much extra value you get by going further. So that may not be a heavy lift, but if someone has a better idea, just concrete examples, VxWorks is one recent one. And the other part was, I think was your name Emily? Okay. To her point, earlier on we might have had we might have had our sequence wrong. I thought our sequence was right, but we started in the use cases working group doing interviews of success stories, which we're now calling phase 2. So we have a bunch started. They're in a document called Sticky Notes. They're incredibly detailed. And one of the things I told the whole team early on is different sectors, so I think this is to your point, different sectors have different nouns and verbs for the exact same thing. So acquisition for the Pentagon is the same as procurement for a bank. And what I had envisioned, and we even recorded a sample of this, is if we pick these ambassadors, could someone do a 5-minute or less intro primer or explainer video on the table we made that uses the nouns and verbs for that sector, right? Very familiar, nice on-ramp, and then they go read the big document. But then I thought, I'm not saying we have to sign up to put videos on the NTIA website, But I do believe that some of this is a translation issue. And if we create that localized language, I think our adoption awareness will go way up.
I like that. So we'll put in the adoption and awareness side of things, multimedia, or multimedia and original or non-white paper communication.
Well, but
could be
also
a
sector
paragraph.
specific.
Yeah.
Sector specific.
Good. Yes, one and then two.
So now that we talked about VxWorks IPNet vulnerability, can we do a case study like that to show how do we go deep enough to answer some difficult problem, address the FDA concern?
I like that. So case studies to show what are the obstacles of going deep, and what are some of the tools and things that you have at our disposal today.
The VxWorks and subcomponent stuff started making my head do noodle things too. And I was thinking of all of the embedded devices that I've seen where they have started with, let's just say, Red Hat Linux. And by the time they got it embedded on the device, they jettisoned so much stuff from it to make it fit, but they still say it's Red Hat Linux. But I'm looking at it going, well, kind of Red Hat Linux. All the vulnerabilities won't apply to it because it's not, I'd have to go component, part by part. The same thing happens with Microsoft's new IoT operating system. You choose which components you want to have in it, but if you just list Microsoft IoT OS, I don't know what that means. So is the SBOM able to address that the way we've conceived of it right now?
So I think this gets, oh, go ahead, Bruce, you've got a two-finger.
I think that we need a component removed for cases like you're talking about. I brought in Red Hat Linux. I took out a whole bunch of stuff. Here's what's left. This is really common, and I think that's something we need to look at.
I've got
Okay.
Kate, Jim, Duncan.
And just to your point about Wind River actually puts their SBOM for their Linux version publicly available, and it takes it right down to the file level. So you have everything that's in Wind River Linux listed as a component, and then if you drill down, you can download each of those components full SBOM that they use to put the image together. And that's sitting there publicly today using the SPDX format. And you can have it in spreadsheet if you want it instead of a tag value. So yeah.
Yeah, just trying to on the remove components option, Jim. Yeah.
So how is removing components different from the OpenSSL case that you talked about, where you just don't use the components?
I agree completely. I think it is at the top level. It's this issue of disposition or context or exploitability. But the thing that is in front of you is, do you want to be even more clear? Do you want to draw a distinction between saying, I'm not calling that code versus that code isn't near here? Yeah. So, Duncan, two-finger on this issue.
So back to that discussion, I do think people trivialize the Appendix 2 of the use cases as only the federal government doing nuclear launch codes cares about all that assurance stuff. Everything we just said is all covered if you actually do all that assurance stuff. So my view is it makes that particular component that we need to follow that much more important, because it's those kind of problems that they've been worrying about the nuclear launch codes, but it turns out it applies to everything.
So let's. Do you want to drill down on that and sort of start to say how?
Well, I just want to say
I
I want everyone to not sort of just blow off it's just Bob and the government stuff when you do all that assurance stuff. It actually addresses all these issues, and we need to do that.
In fact, the telecommunications sector already doing it not an SBOM model, but they just do right. They have a very refined pipeline model that they can say exactly what's in it. It's not an SBOM. Further, yes, Laurie.
I have kind of like a little bit follow-up on this in regards of question of how big is the appetite for actually developing a rudimentary maturity model. So you don't really need to be 1 and 0. It's more like how far are you in regards of, for example, providing the next recursive information? Do you have services which will be able to provide the further follow-up? How fast are you able to do the patches? Do you have contact addresses for certain the abuse or PSERT or whatever. So that's kind of like if this should be somehow involved in inside the SBOM, or should it be referencing the SBOM? How it is interacting? That's up to the discussion. But basically, based on that, you could start assessing your supply chain at the end. Like how big is the appetite for that? That's
Can I respond to that? Oops. So there's actually a program for open source projects, not necessarily for companies, but that open source projects can go in and self-assess, self-certify, and basically put the evidence publicly, and then raise a badge level, a passing. It was started from the Core Infrastructure Initiative, so it's a CII badging, and you can find that type of information. And so certain projects are basically attested a lot of the things that you've been talking about already publicly, and so someone can go and look at it in a transparent fashion.
Brendan.
I'd like to go back a little bit to the question from a couple minutes ago of should there be a way to indicate removed components, because I think it's really interesting. And I'd like to say absolutely not, because if you're taking components out that weren't indicatable in the SBOM some other way, that means that your SBOM is improperly, like, it's not granular enough. And at the risk of channeling my inner Richard Stallman, God help us all, it's not Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's not one thing. It's GNU Linux, and it's 50 other things on top of it. And so you should be able to say, this is all this stuff, and take this out. And this happens all the time in the web context. Like jQuery is no longer one thing. Bootstrap is no longer one thing. It's 50 components. And they're individually includable and they're individually specifiable.
All right. And I think at that point, I think it's very well taken. I saw some nods. And also I think, at least in the short run, it is a subset of the disposition idea that, if we can use this to communicate downstream, it doesn't matter if you have something less than the full component, because compilers, right there, things are being stripped out left and right all the time. But the important thing is to be as clear as possible if you know that something isn't being affected. Yes.
This is maybe we never talked about this. I think the interfaces to other data sets like NVD and whatever not. Do we have a map of that? Is there a proposed map, or
so this is
ongoing work?
I think that's something that we didn't talk about quite enough on the naming side of things. Is on one hand we want to solve the naming side of things, but on the other hand, the value of a name is not just that we have uniqueness. The value of the name is that it's a key to other databases. And so I think that's a good point. Is that something, I know we sort of closed phase one, but is that something that is worth making sure that we include in one of the other documents that we already have? Sorry, the mapping side is mentioned?
It's mentioned in but not just very lightly, but it's in there. It's in the framing doc.
Thank you. So I think that's going to help folks, especially as they're making decisions. How do I pick a name? Oh, one of the goals is making sure that it can map to NVD other things. Duncan.
But to his point, I think he was suggesting there was another bullet to add to your future work item on how to link to other things like licensing database and vulnerability data is a further work item study. So I didn't see any typing when people said anything. That's why I'm asking.
Thank you. So yeah, let's make sure that that's part of the, that we have that. And we'll do some further refinement of this list, both now in this discussion and then afterwards, so that it can be,
It's not, you did some early binding on his naming point, but I think part of this for phase two we should do is there are some potential implications on other institutions like NVD. So for example, Art knows this, but some of us did a critique where there's a really heavy bias in NVD towards commercial enterprise grade software and a real dearth of CVEs for open source projects. And some analysis has been done, and some of our friends in DHS that sponsor that MITRE program have made some strides there. But as we do more SBOMing, it becomes increasingly important. So we should have some interlock and some conversations. I'm looking at one of my friends. We should talk about, as we're more dependent on CVEs, because I'm in my day job, I'm fixing a lot of flaws in open source projects that have no CVE. And there's a lot of other people that are vulnerable because I fixed it, but no one else knows. So can we add to that list proper interlocks with institutions like NVD?
Good. I like that. Okay.
I guess question to Josh on that. So isn't it, I thought the process was if you discovered something like that, you reported it. So there's not a CVE, didn't you report it?
I'm working with, so somebody reported to me. I found out it's a flaw in open source projects that never disclosed. So it's now a multi-party disclosure with ART so that there isn't an accidental emergency.
There's a clarification here. CVEs are supposed to be issued only by the supplier of the software. So if he finds a vulnerability in a third party's piece of software that he doesn't support, then he doesn't get to make a CVE. And then if it's
you can.
Yeah.
No.
So
yeah,
yes,
you can.
No. And then he's supposed to go to MITRE, and then MITRE makes a decision, and they try to coerce the guy to do it or whatever. But something happens. But the other problem is people that don't understand this whole how to get CVEs at all. If they find things, there's no good way for them to report them right now. So there's kind of two aspects.
If only we had some CVE experts in here.
So just for clarity, though.
So
for
hi,
an open
I
source
actually
project-
run the CVE program. So I'm Katie Trimble. I run the CVE program for Department of Homeland Security. In fact, I run all of the vulnerability programs for Department of Homeland Security. So MVD, I run that too. So within the CVE database, yes, you're mostly correct, but you can go to MITRE if there is not a known vendor CVE naming authority or numbering authority that can issue that CVE, or if the CNA is not willing to issue a CVE for it. You can go to MITRE, and MITRE will issue a CVE for it if it is a legitimate vulnerability, or you can come to ART, or you can come directly to DHS. I am a CVE numbering authority myself. I can issue you a CVE.
Great. Yes, without the.
It would be good to know that because this is a process that's farther than I know, and we've issued thousands of CVs, well, hundreds of CVs.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't know the entire process. I knew the part about, we're only supposed to issue CVs for our own stuff. We go to MITRE if we can't figure out or something like that. But further that I could go to you or I didn't know in the past.
So
yeah,
that, I think, is something
that's a failure on our part to communicate the program effectively, and we're trying to make an effort to be better about communicating and marketing ourselves so that some of this confusion is not so prevalent throughout the ecosystem. So that's my fault.
And we can make sure that anything that comes out of us on this topic links heavily to all of those great resources that are being produced. Yes. Les.
Yeah, so feel free to throw stones and heckle me because I missed the last 40 minutes in case you talked about this. But I did want to touch real quick on the this case study for demonstrating the value of deeper level of SBOMs. One point I wanted to make was, in this case study or whatever we end up trying to do here, is there a way we can figure out end of life? Because what I've had a lot of problems with is, and this goes to the configuration that was mentioned earlier, is we have people say, oh, Windows 7 is going end of life, but then, so I'm not going to buy anything, I'm not going to do anything. Oh my God, you're going to, you've got a vulnerable product. That's not always the case, right? So there are things you turn off, things you don't do, things you don't use, things that aren't, right? At some point it may be vulnerable, but it isn't on January 15th, right? Or whatever the date is.
No, I think, and there are a couple of things in there. One of them gets back to this question of exploitability or context. And the other one, which you've touched on, I've heard from other folks, is, is there some work that we can do under the auspices of this to make end-of-life components more visible in public? Not just end of support, but yeah. Art, then Duncan.
Yeah, sorry, very briefly. So clearly end of life is a concern, especially for longer lived physical devices that outlast the software support lifecycle. Nothing that I'm aware of in the SBOM discussions is going to magically create that data, though. You have to ask your supplier to give you an EOL date, and maybe in a standard way, or maybe it's integrated with the SBOM in some way. But without someone providing those dates, we can't make them up or anything. So yeah, obviously, I guess, but yeah.
Duncan.
not to solve the problem, but again, end of life has come up multiple times. I haven't seen EOL typed on the screen, so just for future work items. Oh, there it is. Got it.
Thanks. All right. Other things, and again, this is sort of the wish list section. This is the stuff that you want other people to work on. Then we'll dive into what are you going to do? Bruce and Duncan.
We get to go through the same discussions over and over again. And it would be good if there was a...
Oh, Mike?
Oh, sorry.
We get to go through these discussions over and over again. It would be good if there was documents that kind of documented why the decisions were made that were companions to the ones that we're making right now. So that new people on the project, and we're always trying to get new people, could read about them and not have to go through it again.
Is this something that we could sort of put in the FAQ side of things where could be
That's a fine place. Yeah.
Yeah. Duncan.
So on the point of encouraging other trials or whatever, how are you going to pick, besides healthcare, which again is wonderful that they are doing the POC they did, how are we going to get other POCs involved? Is there a process? Is there just somebody here is going to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm going to do something?
That's exactly how this works, yes.
Okay.
It is a voluntary process. Josh.
You had a high-level section for it. You called it, under extending, you called it use of SBOMs for cloud SaaS containers. I'm aware of some draft questionnaire stuff in Europe for, cloud audit type things, like do you have an SBOM? I guess this is a phase 2 thing, but I just wanted to add to that the idea that these more modern or hosted things, it's more like an API to interrogate the current state of something, and there's some versioning things. So I don't know if it's an entire working group, but there are existing thoughts and existing artifacts we could at least collect. We've been postponing it in this room, but there are some materials we could at least collect that I know of.
I think that's great, and that fits not just into that, but it fits into what does transparency look like, as well as sort of the example that you're talking about in Europe, I think, is sort of fits into the model contract language side of things of how do you ask for this. And as model contract, we can also add that sort of audit or things like that, other business processes that you can sort of have to have that conversation. Other things. Duncan.
So Josh had mentioned before the issue of in the healthcare POC, because of the way they defined the terms of reference of only going one level deep, no one actually asked him for his SBOM. It also got mentioned this morning how in the ideal world it would be great for both the medical device manufacturers and the FDA if the value of doing this in a standard way, somehow we could show that. So I know as a whole volunteer effort, we got to get somebody to volunteer. So I'm trying to come up with ways we could entice someone to volunteer to participate, not from healthcare in the next version of the POC. So putting Josh on the spot some, given your stuff, at least theoretically, and that your components are used in medical devices, is there any way PTC, so asking you as your corporation, could entice any of its customers that you have known overlap with, medical device manufacturers use X, and this IoT device uses X. Can we get this IoT device to be part of the trial? Because then there'd be they're not just two disjointed, two random sectors did a trial. It's actually, no, look, see, this is the same dot. We can draw the picture that they have in the framing document that has that one consumer with the two parts on it. You could actually have a real one.
So it's naturally cross-sector.
Yeah.
Let me see. I understand your point. But for some that left the room, I got a little clarification from Seth, which is we're going to have to go further back than one hop, but at least for that sector of healthcare. But I get your point about a cross-sector inverse ecosystem. Yeah.
Are there things on this list or that we've talked about that you want to unpack a little bit more? So we've talked a lot about non-explodable. Kate.
I think the notion of putting use cases is out there, but also use cases for showing success and showing how people are doing it and making it so it's bite-sizable and people can see an example of it being done. I'm finding cases where people are doing it today and highlighting and asking them to be visible about it.
I think that's great. And I mean, we've got it under the demonstration section here, but I think it's also an awareness and adoption piece.
Did anybody remember that sticky notes thing that Ben and I painstakingly interviewed people? So there's several of these in a Google Doc that you can look at right now. And we thought about doing those short recordings with some of those people. But they use their own nouns and verbs. They identify their sector. They identify their title. So I totally agree we could do more. I just don't want anyone to think there aren't some.
Just put them into some format where they're consumable. Other than, like it's taking it, making it so people find it and look at it, look for it. Sorry, I'll go look later.
Is that findable or readable?
Yeah, the consumable.
Consumable.
All right.
Duncan.
So I guess I assumed, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I assumed under awareness adoption, when you have sector-specific and technology-specific outreach and potential venues and champions, I assumed that included making sector-specific use cases, and I assumed that meant the use case group would go back and dig up the sticky notes and make them something somebody other than the use case group could use, because I would argue they're not consumable right now, but there's a lot of really valuable information there. So we purposely, in the use case group, did a lot of detailed work and then ended up with, I'll call it a very abstract document, that we sort of did that on purpose. But now for phase 2, we can afford to go to that next layer. We don't have to go down to the bottom of the pyramid, which is where the sticky notes are. We just need to go to okay, for healthcare you do this, for automotive you do this, for security industry you do that. I assumed that was covered already, but if it isn't, I think it should be a specific point.
Great, thank you. And it's a good segue to the next part, which is we start to get into the hard side of things, of how are we going to get all of these things. We're on page 3 here. There's only 2 of them are about the things that we sort of identified as, gosh, this is hard problems left, not to mention sort of the original set of suggestions. And we have a number of existing working groups. What I don't want to do is try to distract from getting phase 1 done. And so what we can start to do is say, what are the things that we want to prioritize and what might fit into the existing structures that we have today, and when might it make sense to think about saying, this working group is finished, we can stand down this working group as an organizational structure and spin up a new one. We can have as many working groups as you like. I would not recommend having too many, if for no other reason that it's good to have a decent amount of overlap, or at least a little bit of overlap, other than just having NTIA be at the core of everything. But all of the things that we've talked about today, are there things that folks want to prioritize? And from there, we can start to go into well, what are the priorities that make sense to cluster so that we can start, that they're going to have similar style work, so that we can be, efficient about doing it and efficient about sharing it out. Jim.
I just want to confirm that the assumption there is that the existing working groups have a mandate to continue.
Yes.
Okay.
The existing working groups have mandated to continue in as much as they would like to. Right? Again, this is the joy of having a structure that is defined by the participants. We have path dependency. We've got some good rhythms now. I've learned that I shouldn't plan on doing any work on Friday other than this. But I think at the same time, what I don't want to do is hold us to some of the commitments that we've, the structures that we have. So this is the tyranny of the freedom that has been placed in your hands, is you can define this however you like. Certainly basing it off what we have makes sense. The healthcare proof of concept group, I think, is functioning very well. A lot of work has been put into it. And so don't want to say you guys have to abandon and then reformat of whole cloth. But I want to put it on the table that if folks say, you know what, for example, I'm going to call out the formats group. They say, hey, still want to talk about tooling and maybe in the quick start guide, but from the tooling perspective, it makes sense to say, hey, we're going to focus on the tooling in this domain over here, and the folks that want to focus on tooling this domain can go over here, and we'll try to coordinate to make sure that like everything is easily presentable so that folks can find it all. But we want to be creative. There's a chance to sort of say, what can help us get the work done that we want to get done? Duncan.
So 3 points. First point is, if we could meet not on Fridays, I would certainly appreciate it. Now summer's over, it's not quite as bad, but Friday afternoon on a summer for a meeting is just tough to make. But my actual real points on things where I think focus could be. Assumed in that comment was that there's value in the healthcare POC continuing. I have nothing to do with it, but I really hope they continue it. That was great work, and I hope they do a second version. Yeah. So I'll vote for that one.
Yeah, I think it's a realistic assumption there.
Try to stop, Jim.
Okay. And then my second one of where I would put priority, and again, people might not naturally see it, but I think there'll be more value there than you think, is in this high assurance use case. I think there's much more value there than just for special govy stuff. I think it'll actually get into a lot of these other issues we were talking about. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let's make sure that we spend some time talking about the high assurance model. Are there, Josh?
I want to fuse that with the suggestion for a maturity model, because we were talking last night as well about a maturity model, because it can be an implied roadmap, the crawl, walk, run, or because maybe I think we have mislabeled this the DoD high assurance thing. I think there's just degrees of participation and quality, and perhaps fused with the maturity model, we may have the ability to map what you do next. No matter where you are, this is what you do next. Friendly amendment.
No, I think that's great, and I think I'm very happy with the document as it stands, because it's written, that assurance appendix sort of lays out, here is the value add of doing it, right? In SBOM, as it currently exists, is kind of in I think the security term is keeping honest people honest. If you're interested in detecting active subversion in the supply chain, well, a hash will help. And some of it won't help, right? An SBOM won't prevent someone capturing keys and doing it, except if you carry it to the logical conclusion, which is, I've had conversations with people who say, oh, the entire way we do developer keys is broken. So let's dive into the high assurance side of things, because I think there is a risk of having it devolve to a reproducible build or nothing. And I'm sure a lot of you know folks in the software security space who strongly believe that. And that's right, that is very important for certain spaces. What else is there that we would want to try to think through from this appendix? Oops. Duncan.
I think it's more than just the appendix, because we didn't include everything in the appendix, but the infamous teapot picture, if everyone remembers, that has this sort of all the lines going out with all the different verbs besides contains. Basically, the current framework we're in, we're ending up with just basically, hey, this software contains this other piece of software, and we ended up with 7 or 8 other verbs there. I think those aren't in the appendix, but I do think they are fair game. I think we need to do them. That includes the removal part, in a sense. It includes the issue we got before of it's not complete unless you have all the sub pieces. But you made it by taking this complete thing that had 8 sub pieces and taking out the one. There are ways to specify all that. So it's more than just the pedigree and provenance and integrity. It's also the completeness of the pictures we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm. And are there specifics? So, for example, Lori talked about maybe implements is the right verb?
It's like, I'm not sure if it's the English word, abstractization.
Abstractization, okay. Which is to say this is the implementation of that abstract.
And if needed, you can swap it out for the other one.
Okay. Are there other things that you would want to put in that
Well, all the other ones that were on their chart, there was inherits from, there was the real-time update one, there was like 7 or 8 of them.
Okay. Art, I think that's one of your images, if memory serves.
I think it was the teapot that had the inherits from, it had the real-time download of the software, it had it had all the different things you could put on the line between two boxes.
Chandan gets blame or credit for the teapot, I think. So he's not here to defend himself. Definitely going to blame him.
But all of those is all I'm saying.
So the point in phase 1's relationship includes with a note that you might want more refinement, but we're stopping short at this point of going into those refinements. That's all.
No, but I'm saying as part of this high assurance thing, you need all those other verbs.
Probably, yeah.
All right. So on the assurance side, integrity is something that I think we've started to capture in the framing document, which is signing. As we all know, cryptography is easy and key management is even easier. And so we probably could benefit from having some discussions around that on the assurance side. Are there other things that people want to sort of throw in the assurance bucket at this point? Yeah.
I am not sure if it completely fits in there, but basically to sell the high assurance model, you would need also kind of like a negative use case study. So if you don't do that, that bad thing will happen to you.
So we have some great work that's been published over the last 3 years by CITL. That's done a longitudinal study of consumer-grade firmware in home routers and other devices. And they've shown that there is no systematic progress in firmware protection. So, non-execute, things like that. Thank you, ASLR, that it is not being used. And so is this the sort of thing? Now, what I like about their approach is they've got a very small universe. They've said 6 attributes. They're stable. We're not inventing brand new things for this level of technology. And this level of technology isn't terribly complicated, right? It's stuff that is available in most development kits today, or most build kits today. Is that the sort of thing you'd like to sort of think about as part of the assurance approach?
I think for this working group, we should look at the elements of an SBOM that could support integrity and high assurance, not the entirety of high assurance. Good. So, I mean, I know you have to be literate on those abuse cases, but I don't want this to become another accidental multi-stakeholder workshop.
Good. So can I push back on you for that? Are there elements of the SBOM? Because I agree with you completely. I think that if you're trying to capture all of development in your SBOM, you're going to have a whole lot of data structures that you need to think about, many of which aren't defined in a systematic way. Are there a couple of things that you want to flag?
I mean, just to foot stomp what somebody said earlier, whether it's Art's crop circles or Chandan's, flower petals or teacup or whatever the heck you guys want to call these things, I think we had some work that could be revisited in a subsequent phase, but I don't think the goal is to come up with every high assurance use case. It's really just understanding what's the body of work of high assurance use cases and how would we support those? Just a scoping statement.
Great. Thanks. All right. Other things that you'd like to prioritize. So we've had some conversation about thinking about high assurance, thinking about it from a use case perspective. Powerful. Are there other things that we've talked about so far or that are on this list that you want to prioritize? Mike? Sorry.
The supplier name.
Good. So having a discussion about naming?
Yeah. No, great. Really getting it done. I mean, getting it assigned to something.
Okay. I think that's good. That's something we can prioritize and fits in with, I think, some of the existing workflows.
Just to render what's a private conversation we had earlier, I'm trying to non-rhetorically ask, what's the best starting point? Because CPE, for example, with funding, didn't do it. Do we start there? Is there an alternative that you have in mind? Like, who logically would make such a directory of these things?
Well, if we could persuade FIRST to do it, that would be great. But as far as I know, they only do it for vendors that are members of FIRST. If we need somebody else to do it, then we need to select somebody. CVE to me would be a logical place. But
You mean CPE or?
the CVE organization, the organization that create that. Yeah. Katie.
You did say that you were.
Katie, just to start, there's a chalkboard, you start writing.
I don't think it can be a vendor. I mean, there's plenty of vendors that would do it. We would do it, but I don't think that would be appropriate.
Are there any of the consortia that you're involved in, like at Casey, would that be a good one or not?
I don't think Akasi would do that.
Okay.
I think FIRST is a better guess, but of the other ones I know.
If only we had someone
Yeah.
involved in FIRST.
Actually, I'm going to say exploring FIRST is a reasonable option, but I have my doubts that we'll go there. I fully agree this has to be addressed. It is my hope and very low confidence belief it can be done without a central authority. I do not think a central directory is going to fly. But I don't have an answer as to how to federate it like the other stuff. So anyway.
Just a quick bit of history. I'm going to wear my Dave Waltermeyer hat here. There was, in fact, an attempt to centralize this with the common platform enumeration, part and parcel of CVE and CPE. The challenge was that the resources of that organization, they didn't see it was possible. Software ate the world, and there was just too many things for them to enumerate in a centralized fashion. So it was good for having a format and a single place to look as a way of just listing all suppliers. Aliasing may be something that could be a little more finite, especially when we start thinking about a supplier level. They had an initial vision, but I don't think it sort of has emerged, which is just say, hey, have everyone do it themselves, and that's kind of what we're hoping for. So if there's some vision that we can sort of have for further guidance, that doesn't say you have to do it our way, but just make sure that you have a way of doing it. We've got a bunch of two-finger comments. I got Mark, I've got Duncan, I've got Brendan, I've got, oh my goodness, I've forgotten your name.
Ed.
Ed, thank you. Okay.
So I was just going to point out that just recently had the experience of how does Google solve this problem for when they, are bringing on vendors and other things that they're working with, and they use ICANN. And basically their solution is, if you want to onboard to our system, go get yourself a DNS, because the one thing we know is that a DNS name is unique and verified to an address. And so I actually think that this is the sort of solution we should be thinking about. It actually makes a certain amount of sense.
Kate, do you want a two-finger on Paul?
Yeah, just to quickly. This is actually something that we've been working on with the licensing on SPDX, and that certain companies want to have their own namespace of licenses for their proprietary licenses. And so there is a proposal for namespaces using the DNS side of things there that might be a starting point to look at.
Piggyback on that. Let's see. I'm sorry, the order, Duncan, on that exact point, two fingers.
Yes. So, well, on the exact point when I raised my hand, which was the point before.
Okay.
But so if we could be clear, and we don't have to solve it now, but when we do solve it, if we could be clear, if we're talking about the name of the software that goes in the SBOM at the time of vulnerability, or which isn't at the time. Right now, word it differently. Traditionally, the names that have went in CVEs, when CVE got suggested, is at the point of vulnerability, not at the point of creation of software. I think we're being clear now that we're trying to pick a name for the software at its time of creation, so that every piece of software has one of these, not just once you've found the vulnerability. Is a question. And I'm not saying we have to solve it, but that confusion has confused us in the past, so we should make sure it doesn't confuse us now.
And I worry because this morning we talked about this exact problem, which is software names are not immutable. So I don't think. Yeah, Brendan.
Also, kind of jumping
Mike. Sorry.
So also jumping back to the point at which I raised my hand, I would put in a note, not just because it's convenient to us at GitHub, but also because I think it's helpful. Instead of considering this as a federation problem for naming, just consider it as a namespacing problem. So in our dependency graphs, we often have, here's your GitHub name, which we know because it's on GitHub and you probably published it. And you may have a separate, say, NPM name, but we know that, and so we can just give your name. It's either the vendor name or the software name. It's often different in all four parts of the Punnett square to say this software is named this on GitHub, it is named this on NPM, and just give it a prefixed name as we track it through our dependency tree. And that way we don't need to have a central authority. We can have a bunch of kind of well-recognized namespaces, and if you don't recognize where it is, go find it on DNS or whatever.
Ed and then Bruce.
Yeah, just kind of, to me, part of the challenge is just, first defining what is it we want within our SBOM world. So what makes the most sense as far as, establishing clearly and understanding the identity of these components and the items that are being described by an SBOM. Because I think once you understand that and then what needs to be put in the SBOM, I think that'll help you figure out, now how can I use that as I interact with other systems? So really, I think it needs to be focused in these groups first before we go outside.
Good. No, I think that makes sense. And generation and then mapping. Bruce.
The name, many products have multiple names simultaneously, particularly different versions of the same product where the fix has to get backported will have different names for the different versions. So we can't. So the question about whether it's the version when reported or when the software was made, it just has to be handled with aliases. We can't distinguish there. The other issue is DNS names, and this is a detail. DNS names sound like a good idea, but huge numbers of people can't get a DNS name, so another approach has to be taken. In the third-party components where I work, which is like 3,000, I think something like over 1,500 are names of single individuals that are the supplier. And most of these guys don't have, and ladies don't have those, a DNS name. So, if you want to get GitHub, which is what Microsoft now, as a place to store the name, some people might object to that because it's Microsoft. That's been objected for other reasons. So, the thing is, what I was trying to say before is we need to get a solution here somehow that's acceptable.
But we don't need one solution. That's the point.
If you want to communicate between multiple people, you have to know where the solution is that you need to figure out who the vendor is, at least, or the supplier is for the software. And if everybody gets to make up their own, it's going to be very difficult for us to figure that out. Maybe you can run Google or something to find out all the sites in the world that have the name Siebel in it, or whatever name you're using that looking for. But I don't think that's really feasible.
So besides when we get around to solving this, dealing with the time aspect at what point you make it, I think to Bruce's point on the aliases, just because historically people have used lots of different names for the same thing does not make it a good practice. I think we have to discuss what is where we want to get to. And if where we want to get to is have 10 names for the same thing because it's best for the following reasons, that's great. But if where we want to get to, if life would be more secure if we only had one name, we at least could give that as where we'd like to get to and what would it take to do it. I don't think we should get too tied up in solving. Yes, we have a lot of old problems we have to solve, but we should still also try and look at where would we like to be.
Best practices for naming, we'll add that to the list. Mark, and then I think we'll...
I just wanted to say, when I suggested ICANN, I was specifically suggesting ICANN as the source for namespacing names, not that each individual supplier, by the definition of an individual coder, would be, going out and getting a DNS name, but, if we wanted to, in a federated model, we have to somehow identify, the unique suppliers in the federation, and DNS seems very appropriate because, let's be honest, in most cases, we're talking about, things that probably already have DNS names that are going to be those things. And, maybe GitHub users is, kind of a top level domain for that. And then GitHub is that top level domain, or Maven Central is a top level domain, or NPM.js or whatever. I think that's when I said ICANN, that was what I was talking about, not for the individual component.
Thank you. Just a reminder for folks on the phone, if you want to weigh in on this, *1. You're having some issues, try to back channel. Melinda, I don't see anyone in the queue, is that right?
Thank you. At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Thanks. Always good to make sure that your data system actually correlates with reality. All right, Josh, do you want to close us out on naming?
Yeah, I just want to synthesize, because there's lots of good stuff, but some of them are talking past each other. So Duncan is 100% correct that if we're going to create an SBOM at the time of creation, which lots of our other bodies of work says we should, whatever name we pick can and will change later. So therefore, using Art's prior document that the SBOM MVI does not include vulnerability stuff, but it can reference a different resource that has vulnerability stuff. SBOM's going to have a name supplied that may change over time, and should the second resource needs to exist, which is a list of aliases for that thing. So I'm kind of repeating what other people said, but the temporal nature is when you create the software, it's going to have a name which cannot be guaranteed to stay the same forever, and therefore it necessitates an alias directory somewhere. And no, you don't have to use blockchain. Mean time to blockchain, 6 hours.
All right, so I want to start getting into how we're going to tackle this, but before I want to allow folks to try to say, this is one last thing that you want to try to put on the priority queue. Is there anything else that someone wants to emphasize? By the way, this doesn't lock anyone in. The work that's done will be done by the people who are doing the work. And as you remember from how this process began, things evolve over time. They'll merge, they'll separate, we'll get false starts. That's okay, right? That's the benefit of agile policymaking. But if there's something else that folks like that we've talked about today or that are from this list, now's the time to try to flag it. All right. Well, let's dive into what's actually going to happen next. What are we going to do? Because I think this is really inspiring, humbling, right? Still a lot of work to do. But I think it's time to sort of dive into this. So do the buckets, there's still, right, there are some things that cut across a number of the buckets. But in terms of the work to be done, one, healthcare POC, you guys, I think, are happy moving forward. Give me a second. Happy moving forward, you want to extend it, you'll want to sort of engage in the broader community, but as an organizational factor, you're happy with this? Yeah, okay, thumbs up. Duncan.
So on the healthcare POC, we have both a reasonably closed group with very specific focus and a broad-term objective in phase 2 to involve other sectors. That seems contradictory to me at the moment. So the healthcare POC is going to continue as a healthcare POC.
Yeah.
That will naturally stay a healthcare POC unless we do something different. If we want to get...
Their report clearly documents the fact that they're going to reach out with a bunch of vendors at various levels of the work.
No, I meant to other sectors. If we want to get a sector other than healthcare involved in it.
In the same concept.
Well, you have a bullet
that
says extend it to other sectors. If the default is we're going to have two separate POCs, that's a different issue. If we're going to have a POC involving multiple sectors, it has to be more than the healthcare POC, is all I'm saying.
Sorry for the clarification. I think, and if folks want to jump in,
please change.
Follow on to healthcare proof of concept and then other sector-specific proof of concept.
And my reason for
concept.
Well, my reason for bringing it up is because of the policy and legal issues, which were clearly non-trivial in the healthcare industry. It was more closed than it would naturally be. Say somebody from automotive wants to just join it and make it an automotive. That isn't going to happen unless somebody does something.
Let me try to go. proof of concept, we need the institutions first. And I know that a number of people in the room and I are actively working on that now. But it starts with the people who are going to be participating. And then from there, we'll see what we can do. I thought that both Jim and Michael and Jennings actually did a phenomenal job of making it a very open process, despite it being an NDA'd actual sharing. They did a really good job of making sure that everyone involved who was not a direct participant knew exactly what was going on as it was going on, and could even weigh in on a lot of the details.
Which I want to applaud them on, because I'm not a healthcare person, and I got to do that. So yes, they did that very well. I just want to make sure it can get extended, that's all.
Thank you. Lori.
Would it be possible to get some kind of overview of a process to doing a POC?
Yes, I think there's...
Yeah, in our previous documents, our process is described. And in fact, in the report, the process is described as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and just the brief overview of one of the things that, again, worked really well is a priori defined use cases was perhaps one of the most important components of that, so that they were giving themselves an actual scientific challenge. And the documents are great. They sort of went through, here are the decisions we made. We decided to do this. We decided not to do that. Les.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So, to your comment, is there a desire or an objective to standardize some type of SBOM across industries, or was it just to involve them so they do one?
Well, one of the objectives when we first started this whole mess was the FDA came out and said, hey, medical device manufacturers, you got to do this. And then it looked like it was at least possible that 17 other government agencies were going to do the exact same thing, and in industry we're going to end up with 17 different sets of rules to follow. So NTIA said, whoa, that's probably not going to be the best in the long run. Let's see if we can get one set of rules to follow, and if this FDA set of rules, if it was used by the DoD, if it was used by, I don't know, Social Security Administration, whatever other ones needed it, if we could come up with one way to do it, that would benefit everyone. And I think we've all in our heads reached that conclusion, and we even had that as sort of an objective to try and reach on the POC, but with only one, you can't do that. So the hope would, or at least my hope would be, we could sort of prove to the world there's actual value to PTC in that to device manufacturer 1, it did this, and to auto manufacturer 2, it did the same thing, and look, there's value to that. So that would be my hope. It might be an unrealistic hope, but I thought that was the whole reason for the multi-sector.
So when we started this, in my recollection, is you are correct, right? What happened with like say us, myself, in this area was we said, well, to do this, we've never done this before, we want a proof of concept. So we just went after that, right? So then we did our proof of concept. So I don't disagree with you. We would like for other sectors to come into that. Now, should they be a part of this proof of concept? We can all debate that, right?
So I feel like we're now talking in circles. I think by definition, executing a industry-specific and organization-specific thing is going to be a bespoke process. Anyone who moves forward, hopefully, will have this great path to follow. And if we can involve multiple sectors, that's lovely. Like that's the whole goal is to get more organizations doing this, and that I think speaks to documenting successes. Which returns back to how are we going to do some of the stuff we've talked about. So yes, Jim.
So let me just bridge to that. What we said in our conclusion was that what we came up with, the approach, the processes, the formats that we used is directly applicable to other sectors, to other verticals, right?
Completely.
But the proof of concept itself was because there was a nexus of people in both the consumer side and the production side who were willing to do that.
And I will go one further just to put a point on the table. Something that this community was very clear to do last year was to define, this was last fall, define what they were doing not as a pilot, but as a proof of concept. Now, something that we can start to think about putting on the table is, if we now know enough to know that we're going to be heading off in this direction, do we want to consider it a pilot? But I want to leave aside the POC model because, again, the folks in the healthcare space, I think, have their legs under them and have, in the course of doing their work, sort of thought about what they might be next, or at least thought about how to think about what might be next. So the next question is, when we think about refining this model, documenting further successes, strategies for awareness and adoption, and tooling, tooling, processes, and services. Thank you. What are the mechanisms that we're actually going to start working on this? Because again, it will take some time for us to self-organize a little better. Where do we want to start with this? And so one option is just to go to the individual working groups and say, hey, of the things that we've laid out, does it make sense to stay intact? Or do you want to sort of say, hey, our mission is done for our short run, and we're going to sort of step back, and then all of us are going to step forward in slightly different reorganizational structures. So I think there's value to think about both sides. Josh.
The way my brain works is I kind of need to see this whole thing and kind of affinitize it. My hypothesis is some of these will naturally fit with the existing momentum and groups that we have. Some of them are unlikely to happen with the existing groups we have, and we probably want to spin up adjacent ones. For example, with the coordinated vulnerability disclosure one we did, there were some surveys and some PR and marketing personnel that understand the finer points of communication. We haven't attracted a lot of those folks. We have some by accident, but we haven't deliberately done so. So I'd want to cluster these maybe after I've looked at the whole document, maybe not workshopped right now, and at least propose. We think there's a natural fit to have the use cases ones do this, but we don't see anybody yet that's a natural fit for this. Could we spin up another group? So not an answer, but a step towards an answer.
Thank you. And I like what you're doing, because I think we can have a straw man approach to it. So for example, Art just stepped out of the room, so we can start with him. Right, the folks who've been thinking about, let's whiteboard out what this looks like. Well, I know that Art's group has already had a discussion of naming. I know that they've had an initial discussion around what transparency looks like, and some of these sort of further refinements of defining this stuff could be a decent fit. On the other hand, folks can say, no, it's not. Similarly, on the use case side of things, doing a renewed push to find the demonstrated successes, having the stories to tell. There's a lot of that directly feeds to awareness and adoption, but it also is in very much the demonstration side of things, as well as tooling needs and high assurance needs.
So on that front, we have a couple people from Git or from JFrog or some of the tooling, but I believe we might attract more folks from the tooling if we had an ambassador initiative for the development ecosystems and languages. So maybe that fits into an existing one, or maybe you need to build it and then they'll come.
So let's talk about tooling.
So kind of building on the recurring Cyclone discussion from this morning, my thought was that tooling and standards and formats go together pretty well, because I think as we build more tooling, I've been sketching tooling, and unfortunately it's not in a state I can share with anybody. I've been noticing, this doesn't quite fit the way I needed to when I go from 2 or 3 dependencies to 500 or 600. Thanks, Node.js. So I think enabling that dialogue to continue so that we can frankly rewrite the formatting as we discover major problems would be helpful.
Great. I think something that Kate has talked about is saying, as we begin to think about slices of tooling, there's a natural way of thinking through things. So for example, what are all of the tools that we have today that can generate a SWID file from a build process? What are all of the ways that we have of, Kate, you want to give some further examples?
Yeah, how do we go about analyzing a container and the implications of using a container in the remote services? How do we basically deal with things that are updatable in the fields or not updatable in the fields? So there's a large space that I think we could probably start looking at, saying, okay, we want to handle this sort of scenario. What tooling is there? What's not there? What do we want? So lots of scope, and yes, I agree. It'll form. Here's some gaps in our formats, and it'll also form how do we get to the next step. But doing a survey here seems like it's a useful exercise.
And so let's continue to pull this thread of the folks that are going to be thinking, because I think it makes sense. The formats group started off as the folks that were committed to saying, how do we build this stuff? And so it's a natural segue into it. Identifying needs that aren't met today is going to be a big part of that. There's going to be some work that the use case group is going to probably want to find some way of engaging in. But I think it makes sense at to sort of have the operational collection happen at the S&F group. Duncan.
So I agree with tooling goes to formats. That one makes sense to me. The sentence before you said that was that the use case group would do the new use cases for all this other stuff we're doing, and they do the awareness and adoption. From my view, there's a gap in awareness and adoption in other words, there's an awareness and adoption issue independent of the other three groups. I do not think the use case group should accept all of that.
Agree completely. Right, it's on here in that framing because it's a set of needs that are cross-cutting, and just as champions in sectors, maybe a use case group expertise has sort of built itself around that. We've got automotive, we've got financial, we've got DoD land, but of course on the technical community, that's probably a different approach. Are we ready to start thinking about a higher level strategy for awareness and adoption?
I do see it as a matrix, I guess, to put slightly differently, because if our group's R&D and we've captured a bunch of products for these different sectors, we still need a marketing team.
Yeah.
And so would the developer marketing from standards group. So an abstracted marketing team, I wouldn't call it marketing, but it does seem like we could each use more outreach, inbound and outbound.
I think it's sort of related to the comment about having a gold deck so that we all sort of roughly stay on message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like. Right, we are all in our own worlds, and right, a lot of us are in the business world. We're competing. That's great, and so I like the term of have a common message as you go and talk about these various things to sell widgets or do what it is that we're doing. So I think that's a great point. Kate, putting you on the spot for that one, is that something that you think we may want to stand up a new group from folks that perhaps have a little less in the weekly meeting and a little more commitment to do an active mailing list type engagement? Is that something that would be useful?
That would work. I'd say try it, and if it isn't working, switch to another method. But I think having something that's common that everyone can go and see and comment on, it's been working well for the documents.
Yeah, I think I agree. Duncan.
Starting out like I'd hope we'd want to end, for any new development of documentation-y stuff, which I would consider the awareness and adoption stuff to be of that category. We want to sort of come up with the common decks and everything. I would recommend to try and do it in something like GitHub. Doesn't have to be GitHub. Pick a different one. Pick Bitbucket. I don't care. But software industry has put a really lot of work into how to do collaborative work offline. We don't tend to use it, other than we use, Google Docs, and I don't think that's the best way for developing this message stuff, particularly because I like the idea of issues. I like the idea of seeing who made what change and stuff. I'd rather start there.
So I'll give you just sort of a very brief NTIA perspective, which is, if you're writing an academic paper, you always want to do it in LaTeX with BibTeX. Collaborating with someone outside the academic environment, you're going to have a bad time. This process is usually NTIA processes are, one of the reasons I really like them is because they bring together tech people and policy people. having had to hold people's hands as they work through, introduction to GitHub. It's not impossible, just a little difficult. On the other hand, we're lucky. I think this particular community does have more technical people, or at least people who are familiar with GitHub and who've used it before.
I mean, there's WYSIWYG markdown editors and stuff. It's not as hard nowadays as it used to be. I don't know if you've tried using it all lately, but making web page stuff. I'm not talking about developing software. I'm talking about developing web pages in a common spot.
Any further thoughts? I think at a certain point, it's going to make sense for a working group after they've defined a new scope to sort of have the how we're going to talk. I think that's a local decision that makes sense. But any further thoughts on sort of the modality of collaboration?
I'm just giving you a little less diplomatic. I hate the idea of doing GitHub, and it's not that it's not good for a lot of the folks in this room. It's that there's so many other stakeholders where that is a debilitating barrier to entry, no matter how easy you make it. Like, there's going to be management folks. There's going to be, I just think we need, I hate to say lowest common denominator, but there's a whole bunch of people I need in the fold that would never get in the fold if they have to get a GitHub account.
So just to be clear, I'm not asking it because you want them to be part of the development team of making these documents. I'm talking about for how we display these documents. A web page you go to, you give them a link to get to it. How did we make that web page? We're making the web page. We're not asking them to make the web page. If we're going to be developing that kind of documentation, and I would think we'd want this to be a link on the web.
And all right, Kate, last word, and then we'll.
I think we give mixed modes here that we can use. We can use things like Google Docs for very collaborative ad hoc, and then once we're all comfortable, we can log it up on something like GitHub so that it's more accessible and there's a history. But I think we're going to need to work with both.
Yes, use the right tool if your goal is to have a very solid first draft and then allow lots of people to edit it so it changes over time. GitHub's great. If your goal is to have an enduring static draft, PDF probably captures most of what you need. Okay, so we've talked about some of these issues about how we're going to get things done. What I'd like to do is start to get everyone to think about what's going to happen after we've all had a week or two to relax after these initial phase 1 drafts are done. So, and again, some things I think slotted up reasonably well. We've got healthcare POC. Ideally, we'll have maybe some other folks by then who might be interested. I'm going to be giving a lot of talks over the next few weeks and having a lot of meetings, try to bring more people into this room. On the tooling side of things, I think taking that punctuation and coming up with sort of a new set of charters, here are the things that we want to do, not committing, but saying this is what we think our initial goals and work plan is going to be, and then moving forward on that. So that leaves the use case group and the framing group. The use case group really had a tough problem, right? It was trying to get people to be honest about the work that they were doing, and then finding a way to take that narrative and help communicate it to a broader audience. I thought that was a phenomenal job. Moving forward, is this a community that wants to sort of stay together and try to have the next steps? Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one. You can say, yes, it's a great fit. You can say, no, the work that's done, right, it is completely fair to say the work that we have to do doesn't fit perfectly with how we were organized, and so we can disband and then re-come together.
I'm chewing on this. I think Duncan might have helped me a little bit. I just drew a little 3-level pyramid where we started at the bottom with ground truth, and I don't think this group was ready for that yet. I think we've become more ready for it, but then said it wasn't consumable. I think so the bottom of the pyramid, which is a fact-based of way too much detail, we have a good start. Perhaps it could be packaged better. Top of the pyramid is the doc that we are circulating for review. I think what we're looking for is the middle tier, which is maybe a 1-pager, consistently readable and consumable abstraction of those sticky notes things. So my hunch is we could absorb it is the short answer. The part I'm not sure we could absorb, and I do think we need some extra help that's not in the room because we've repelled them or failed to attract them, is who's going to come up with the strategic agenda of these are the developer conferences we should have an SBOM talk at. These are the regions we should go to. Here's the canonical, I just use the word canonical. Here's the most effective set of slides to pluck from.
Sure.
Here's blog posts or, podcasts we should be on. Like the outreach part is a different skill set than I think we have in the room. With apologies to anyone that is in the room, but most of the talkers have a different skill set, and I think we have to augment it with that latter skill set.
And want to be clear that one of the things we'll be doing as we move to phase 2 is really pounding on people's doors to say, hey, there's a lot of new work to come and get involved in, come join. The question that I want to try to at least get people thinking about now is, pulling on your thread here is, hey, there's the capturing experience, and then there's this awareness and adoption piece, or outreach. I think you did a great, that's even better than awareness and adoption. Is that something that still could be under those auspices, or should that be a new group? And if other folks have a chance to chime in, I think something that sort of Kate hinted at is that could be something that would be a separate working group that didn't necessarily have to have the regular weekly phone calls because they weren't going to be drafting a document after they came up with a high-level strategy. It would be, let's have regular check-ins. Let's make sure that we have situational awareness through other tools.
I guess at the moment, in lieu of another home, we can be the default home, but I do want to attract people like a Jen Ellis or others that could maybe organize and cross-pollinate.
If anyone is fond of swearing heavily with a British accent, Brendan.
So I'm not necessarily the right person to lead the outreach efforts, but GitHub does occasionally talk to some developers who don't think we're just Microsoft. And we're happy to do things like, publish on our big blog and generally all the outreach efforts we have. It's a little late for Universe, which is our megacon, but certainly come next year, there are ways we could integrate into Satellite, which is our European conference, or a year from now, like we have some resources we can throw at evangelization.
I'm going to ask for ideas. So I want to fork that conversation. I see Kate jumping in.
I just,
okay.
There's a lot of events that go on at the LF, and I keep a track of a lot of other related ones that I'm happy to pull into a master sort of set that are developer related, and certainly happy to crowdsource a master set to go after.
So let's spend 5 minutes now, not enumerating every single developer conference, but enumerating classes of types of events or communities that we would want to engage or could think about engaging. So we've got developer conferences, and can we subdivide developer conferences into by language or universe, by tool? How else do we want to subdivide developer conferences or developer meetings? Yes?
I'd also say we want to reach out to the legal community.
The legal community. All right.
And the supply chain community, and the supply chain community as well as the security.
Hang on. I want to tease those each. So when you say the legal community, I've even met a few lawyers in Washington, D.C. Are there?
So I'm thinking like there's compliance. There's compliance. The compliance and export control. Not just licensing, but there's people who care about what is actually going through people's hands that have a perspective here to be bringing to the table.
I have a good relationship with the folks with the offices in the floor directly below me, office by the name of BIS, so they handle that in government. So you mentioned that, and you said supply chain. Can you be more specific on that?
So there's various conferences and areas I'm not comfortable with knowing about with supply chain. I was talking to someone who was working on brokerages of things going through import and export boundaries and things like that. That part of it in particular, I think there's pieces that they're going to want to interact with and they're going to be wanting to participate in eventually. And so reaching out to some of the more traditional supply chains, the automotive supply chain, for instance, things like that.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that Bob has been running for, 15 years now, SSCA, the supply chain? Oh, wow. Didn't know they'd been multiplying. How productive. Duncan, classes of outreach.
Josh's original point, you started getting into, I'll say, actually solving.
Sorry. So 3 points. When I raised my hand with a 2, you have now gotten into solving the issue as opposed to the original question of should it be in one of the existing groups or new working group. So I guess I would vote for new working group because, as Josh mentioned, there's a class of people not here, the people in communications.
Talk about that, yes.
Now, so I still vote for that. But now on your particular ones you're asking for, I think you need to go at a class of people called the executives. Okay, so things like CISQ with the Trustworthy Manifesto. I don't know if you've hit them up with. They actually have in there, you got to have an S-bomb, it's in the Trustworthy Manifesto.
Worked well with them, yeah.
So hitting up like them. And to the legal issue, I don't know if you've hit the Legal Hackers group here in D.C. yet, but you should give the talk at Legal Hackers. So.
I've had several interns who went on to run that community. So the Legal Hackers side of things, but so let's do Jim and then Josh.
So those are what I would call horizontal communities.
Yes.
We should consider vertical communities.
Please.
So, I mean, the obvious one to me is healthcare and medical device.
If only we already had substantial penetration in that particular vertical. Of all the verticals in the entire digital ecosystem. So let me turn that back at you. I joke a little bit, but that's one that I feel pretty comfortable, and I know that the Sector Coordinating Council is keeping an eye on us, and I know that the ISAC is watching us.
Right.
Are there parts of that community that you think there's still a lot more work to be done in outreach, awareness, adoption?
Yes.
Great.
A single word answer is okay. Right?
Excellent.
So similar to that, and Alan just mentioned it, so this is less to Alan and more to the rest of us. In our most recent document, we do talk in that network effect section about the role that ISACs and ISOWs and sector coordinating councils can play. I believe you're talking to a bunch of ISACs.
I'm going to be speaking to the Council on ISACs next week.
So through that, each of those sectors may tell us what the right watering holes are for those verticals, right? So the energy folks, the manufacturing folks. So they'll, just like we've done a better job on healthcare, there are other designated critical infrastructure sectors or even commercial sectors that could give us a roadmap. So the roadmap is go around and ask them for the roadmap of the most strategic watering holes so we don't spend a lot of time on the wrong stuff. But if we're going to bring these topics to those, I too was thinking vertical.
Just going back to the overarching ones, safety is also another community we need to be reaching out to because they have a distinct need for it.
Safety.
Safety, critical infrastructure.
ICS, yes. So we've had a number of conversations with particular vendors. I've been talking to the organizer of one of the bigger ICS security conferences. Are there other classes of, there's the ICS JWG. Are there other sort of ways that we can reach into the ICS community?
I know the one you're referring to, and that's kind of like the cybersecurity conference, but I think beyond that, like there's industrial IoT, huge conferences that have no security content, but we could potentially bring some security.
And they need the provenance stuff too.
That you guys talked about.
One's even run by Josh's company, but yeah.
I actually don't even mean that one, but yes.
Great. Yeah.
So on your safety question, I don't know if ARC is one of the ones you have on there already. It's a big industrial one down in Florida. Once a year, my wife gave safety talks at it for ExxonMobil. That's the only reason I know it exists. But they care a lot about supply chain and they care a lot about safety, and they know zero about cybersecurity.
What about Charlie and Auto ISAC? Charlie Hart was.
So the auto sector, I think, is a great place to engage. And I'll be speaking at the Auto ISAC Summit in October. Are there other automotive venues or angles that we want to think about from engaging in that sector?
Automotive one.
Automotive.
So scope question first. You want international, or you just want to stick U.S.?
We definitely wanted to. That was once we were done with this. My next question was, "Hey, these are all American."
So for auto,
yes.
I just got back from Geneva from the Study Group 17 meeting, which has a joint meeting as part of the ITU runs this consortia of standards groups involved in the automotive industry that has some acronym like ICE or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but I can look it up for you. But that's one you might want to get on their agenda because you can really.
What's the first number after ITU for that one? Which
well, Study Group 17 was the cybersecurity. ITUT Study Group 17 was what I was at.
Right.
But they're just one of all the people who sat at the table, and this group whose name I forget, the chair of it, who was I think from Hyundai, but I don't remember, was at it. And it's, it's got ISO, it's got ITU, it's got IEC, it's got the Auto ISAC was there. It's got a bunch of them. Nice. So I don't know when they next meet, but you might want to be on that one.
I will follow up with you about that. Other ways that we want to think about outreach?
Auditors, ISO auditors, and audit community.
Yeah. Auditors. I know that the International Accountants Association, or whatever those letters rearrange, has done a lot of work in cybersecurity. This could be a new way for them to do it. I think that'd be the auditing community. I know we have a number of folks from the big three on our list. In fact, I hope that no one's... Melinda, is anyone waiting in the queue?
Thank you. We do have two standing by. Our first is from Joe. Your line is open.
Hi, Joe Jarzenbeck with Synopsys. I've been quiet on this whole thing, but you've been asking a question about supply chain, and there's actually groups within the Department of Commerce who are running supply chain groups, such as the folks at the NCCOE. They're running a supply chain assurance industry day, and it looks like the way they're coming up based on the industry participants, the solution for supply chain risk management for them is buy from the OEMs and you'll be good. So that's how they're pushing it. They don't want to be revealing of what's actually inside their activities. I will tell you that's also true of the DHS CISA run.
And Joe, I'm going to cut you off because I make a point to not have any negative discussion of other federal efforts at these discussions, but I think there is a lot of room to talk, especially because those efforts predate this. And so in some ways, if they were running around saying SBOM is the answer last year, we would have said, no, it's still premature. Those are great things to dive into. And I've spoken to the DHS team. I'll reach out to my NIST colleagues and talk to them.
Okay, with the ICT SCRIM task force, even in working group 3, that's about information sharing, when I brought up the need for having SBOM, if you really want transparency to be able to understand that, and you will have companies who will say, absolutely not. I am not going to reveal my intellectual property.
I've had a lot of conversations with our colleagues over at DHS, and in fact, have asked them to steer clear of the SBOM issue just because you guys don't want to have to start going to 2 sets of government meetings. So we try to at least have a little bit of effort on that from a lane perspective.
I'd like them to at least point to the efforts that NTIA is leading with the multi-stakeholder activities.
Excellent.
And that should at least be part of that. So we've had those conversations.
Thank you.
Just understand that you've got other activities that are talking about supply chain risk management who want to steer away from SBOM.
Thanks. No, that gets to a lot of the outreach effort that we're going to need. And next, we've got Cassie on the phone, who hopefully can give us some insight into the ICS side of things.
Yes, yeah, and that's what people have already mentioned all of this. This is Cassie Crossley from Schneider Electric. So once we get a comprehensive list together, I can definitely send it across globally to our standardization and organization that deals not just with cybersecurity, but with all sorts of different organizations to see if they have some thoughts and suggestions for conferences. And I agree with the whole, let's do a separate working group. I think that's the best way to approach it because this is a very large topic.
Excellent. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So we have just a few minutes left. Josh?
Just one more class without getting into the specific ones. I've been starting to talk to insurers who care about this, because this becomes a way for them to assess relative risk. So wouldn't know which conferences, but that's a stakeholder group we could look at.
That's a great point. Thank you. So a couple of things. One, I still want to talk to the framing group and see if we think that that is a good starting point to think through some of the refining and extending. And it could be that that group says, actually, it's not. But what I'm going to propose as your straw man is to say that group can be where some of those discussions start, and we do a little more enumeration and prioritization. And then if it turns out that simply the folks in that group aren't interested, or they need further expertise, or they say, nope, we're tired of doing this, we want to go become painters in southern France, they can make that decision. Any thoughts and reactions to that? It's the end of the day where people are just wearing down.
Art's thinking really hard. He doesn't want to answer, I don't think. So
I think Art would look great in a beret.
He wants to paint. So when you say expertise, what expertise are you thinking?
It's a great question. So as we start to think through some of these issues, I think they're each going to have their own approach for expertise. So for example, high assurance stuff, we're going to need some people who think about offense, right? You're building against threats. And so we're going to, that discussion shouldn't happen without having, folks who have very real understanding of the real-time threats. Sharing SBOM data, operational considerations on the customer side as well as the supplier side. And by the way, that's a multi-hop issue. So sharing from one open source project down to the next, it's going to look very different than how do I get my data to someone who's got an embedded device in a power plant. So having those different perspectives. And of course, the exploitability and context issue, that's heavy on the software engineering and software security side. So all of these efforts, just as the work that the framing group did in the first place, required many different perspectives to actually flesh it out. That's, I think, one of the reasons it took a while, is because we had to have all of those perspectives at the table to have the vision that the team wrote, that Art and Michelle wrote. I think it's going to further require that. Does that make sense?
So you're wanting the framing group to comment on whether they want to pick any of that up? I guess I wasn't following exactly there.
That, I think, would be the general vision, is at least from the first wave. Now, Art, you want to
Yes, just that makes general sense to me. I would want to take this to the group and kind of gather opinion and consensus. But again, I don't know how many pages we're on here of notes, but there's a handful of things here that probably fit in framing. My suspicion is the framing group in some form probably should continue. But, we're declined to answer or make a commitment on the spot here.
Sure.
Until,
so
a little bit later.
One thing that we always try to do at these meetings is we're going to post the video of this as soon as possible. It'll take a few days. But we always post the notes without editing because they're taking in front of you. For this discussion, because it is trying to set up the next set of approaches, what I'm going to do is try to do a little more refining of this discussion and propose some tentative buckets, as well as try to flag what I heard in the room today about priorities. And so it'll take a little longer than usual to get the notes out from this. What I can tell you is that since we're starting this process in sort of a new direction, ordinarily I would say the next meeting would be a virtual meeting. I try whenever possible to make sure that people don't have to get on planes. I'm aware of how unpleasant it is. I think that because the next meeting that we're going to have is really going to require some hands-on discussion and refinement, and the chance of different groups to start to talk across each other, I think it makes sense to have that meeting in person. The tentative date I have is November 18th or 16th? 16th, thank you. Which is a Monday. It's not right before Thanksgiving. I looked and I didn't see massive conferences in either security, energy, or healthcare. Didn't look at the development world.
Did you mean the 18th?
18th is Saturday. Then that would be the 18th. Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying. We try to do our due diligence before we put anything in writing. So the vision would be to reconvene here, having had the first wave of potential discussions in the working groups. What we'll do beforehand is work very hard to communicate with the broader list, right? Most of you are in the working groups. You know that those aren't massive working groups. There's a dozen each or so, maybe 24. Lots of lurkers, and that's okay. Lurkers are important because they complain when something goes wrong. We've had a lot of stakeholders who show up just to make sure that we're not doing something that's absolutely terrible. That's great. That's how this works. But what we want to do is make sure that we can really reach out to the broader community again. And hopefully, as we do that wave of seeking and publicity, that you guys will help and start to share and reach back into your networks and engage. So that is the plan going forward, which is we've got working groups have their marching orders for finishing these documents. We're going to have them out by the first week of October, maybe the first week-ish of October. You've got 2 weeks to get feedback on the draft documents. If you need a little light reading on the plane, make sure to grab your hard copy on the way out. And we're going to try to tackle this very large set of things to do. And I think that's a great place to sort of end things, which is to say, we've made incredible progress. I don't want anyone to walk out of here without feeling really happy that this community, thanks to your hard work, this isn't NTIA, this is you, have actually said, oh, SBOM can really be a reality. This is something that is going to make us better off. We know what it is. We know why we should do it. We have an idea of how to do it. And we've seen that people actually did it. But that's not enough. We still have to do a lot more work on answering some of these remaining issues and having this broader outreach campaign as well. So with that, I think we can all relax after a day of pretty solid work. And if you're not running for a plane, there is a nearby place that we go to have a celebratory chat and to have some of these offline conversations that are where the work actually gets done of this. So I hope, oh, yes. There's a question. No. And last, I want to thank Luis for helping us and for NTI's brand new intern, so new that I'm going to butcher her name, Svantje.
Yes.
Oh, Svantje. Svantje, who is a 2L at Catholic Law, so if anyone is looking for a technically literate lawyer, she'll be available in about 1.5 years. So with that, thank you all. I felt this was a very productive meeting. And that concludes the webcast and the phone call. Thank you, Melinda.